My name is Bella Harrison. I am 32 years old, and I have spent the last decade of my life transforming chaos into crystalline financial order as a senior tax consultant and CPA. My world is one of billable hours, specifically $450 for every 60 minutes of my strategic brain power, and I am the person people call when their empires are crumbling under the weight of an IRS audit. But on May 14th, at exactly 2:22 p.m., standing in the sterile, over-air-conditioned lobby of Fairfield Medical Center in Connecticut, my professional armor didn't just crack, it shattered. I remember the exact vibration of my phone in my hand, a silent notification for a wire transfer that meant nothing, while the scent of industrial-grade lavender floor cleaner and burnt espresso from the lobby kiosk clogged my lungs. My mother, Beverly Harrison, stood before me, looking as though she had just stepped off the pages of a high-end equestrian magazine in her tailored, cream-colored linen suit from Theory, her blonde bob not having a single hair out of place despite the humidity outside. She didn't offer a hug or even a nod of acknowledgement. Instead, she tightened her grip on her quilted Chanel boy bag and spat out the words that would haunt my sleep for months. "Your presence here only fast-tracks her end, Bella. Grandma doesn't want to see a granddaughter who traded family values for quarterly reports. The cruelty of it was calculated, a precision strike delivered with the same cold efficiency I usually reserved for slashing unnecessary corporate overhead." My father, Richard, stood 3 paces behind her, leaning against a polished mahogany pillar, his eyes fixed on his 2024 midnight black Tesla Model S key fob as he mindlessly toggled the lock. He was a man of silence and expensive tastes, a developer who built suburbs but couldn't build a bridge to his own daughter. They had spent the last 72 hours orchestrating a masterpiece of manipulation, telling me through clipped 2-sentence text messages that Helen, the woman who practically raised me while they were busy social climbing in Greenwich, was slipping away, and that her final wish was to be surrounded only by those who truly loved her, which, according to them, pointedly excluded me. They painted me as the cold-blooded capitalist, the girl who missed Easter dinner because of an M&A deal in London, conveniently forgetting that the $20,000 private nursing care Helen was currently receiving was being billed directly to my American Express Centurion card. I looked down at my feet, noticing a small scuff on my black leather Christian Louboutin pumps, and for a second, the world felt tilted. I felt like a ghost in my own life. This was the Fairfield Medical Center, a place where I had donated 6 figures to the oncology wing last year, yet I was being barred from room 412 as if I were a common trespasser. Beverly took a step closer, the clicking of her heels on the polished Italian marble sounding like a countdown. She leaned in, and I could smell the faint, expensive trail of her Joe Malone wood sage and sea salt perfume. She told me that Helen had specifically asked why I wasn't there 2 days ago, and when Beverly told her I was busy with a client's portfolio, Helen had allegedly turned her face to the wall and stopped speaking my name. It was a lie. I knew it in the marrow of my bones, but the way Beverly said it, with that practiced quiver in her voice, and that mask of maternal disappointment, made my knees feel like they were made of water. I stood there, clutching the handle of my Toomey briefcase, which contained a signed power of attorney and a set of medical records I had stayed up until 3 a.m. reviewing with a specialist from Johns Hopkins. My hands were shaking, a physical betrayal I hadn't experienced since my first board presentation. I wanted to scream that I was the one who knew Helen's favorite flower wasn't the roses they brought, but the simple yellow primroses that grew near the creek. I wanted to tell them that I was the one who recorded her stories about the Great Depression while they were at cocktail parties. But the words were caught in a throat constricted by years of being told I was too much and too ambitious. Richard finally looked up, his face a mask of bored impatience, and checked his Rolex Submariner. He sighed, a heavy, theatrical sound, and told me that if I had any respect left for the woman who gave me everything, I would turn around, walk through those sliding glass doors, and get back in my BMW M5 and drive back to the city where I belonged. The injustice of it was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in my chest that made every breath feel like I was inhaling glass shards. They were standing there, guarding the elevator like twin gargoyles of elitism, while my grandmother, the only person who ever looked at me and saw a human being instead of a line item, was dying alone. Or worse, dying believing I had abandoned her for a paycheck. I looked at the digital clock above the reception desk. 2:24 p.m., 2 minutes. It had taken only 120 seconds for them to effectively orphan me. I thought about the cost of the suite she was in, $2,400 a day, and how I had worked through holidays and birthdays to ensure she never had to set foot in a state-funded facility. And this was my dividend, being told I was the toxin in her bloodstream. As I turned toward the exit, the automatic doors hissed open, letting in a gust of humid Connecticut air that felt like a slap. I walked past a 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe parked in the handicap zone, its engine idling with a low, expensive hum, and I realized that my parents weren't just protecting Helen, they were protecting their narrative. I was the villain in their story because my success was a mirror they didn't want to look into. Every step toward my car felt like a betrayal of the woman in room 412, but the wall they had built, a wall made of guilt, fabricated quotes, and a lifetime of emotional neglect, was currently too high to climb. I sat in my car, the interior smelling of expensive Napa leather and the lingering scent of the peppermint tea I'd grabbed at a rest stop on I-95, and I watched the reflection of the hospital in my rearview mirror. I wasn't just leaving, I was retreating to regroup. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You see, when you spend your life analyzing the fine print of multi-million-dollar contracts, you learn one very important thing. The loudest person in the room is usually the one with the most to hide. My mother's desperate need to keep me away from that bedside wasn't about Helen's peace of mind. It was about control. And as I shifted my car into drive, the engine of my M5 roaring to life with a precision that calmed my fraying nerves, I made a silent vow. If they wanted to treat our family like a business, then I would start acting like a majority shareholder. Now, let me take you back to how this all started, to the quiet Sunday afternoon 3 weeks ago when I first noticed the discrepancies in the trust fund statements Beverly thought I wasn't looking at. Because in the world of the Harrisons, money was the only language spoken fluently, and I was about to prove that I spoke it better than anyone. Family isn't just blood and shared holiday photos in front of a fireplace in a house with a 30-year mortgage. Family is the person who stands by you when the world turns gray, and my parents had just forfeited their seat at that table. This wasn't just a hospital visit anymore. It was the opening move in a war they weren't prepared to fight. For 5 excruciating, soul-crushing years, I carried this invisible but devastating weight on my shoulders while my life dissolved into an endless cycle of 80-hour work weeks spent in the glass-walled fortresses of Manhattan. As a senior M&A consultant, I existed in a world where midnight was just the halfway point of the workday and where closing multi-million-dollar deals meant sacrificing every shred of a personal life I might have once imagined. While my peers were posting photos from their Mediterranean cruises or purchasing their first sleek Brooklyn condos, I was climbing into the driver's seat of a battered silver 2016 Honda Civic with over 120,000 miles on the odometer, a car I refused to trade in because every single spare cent of my income was funneled into the aggressive repayment of my $82,400 student loan debt. I remember the exact texture of the worn steering wheel and the way the engine would cough on cold mornings, a constant reminder of the financial prison I was working so hard to escape. I lived in a tiny, cramped studio in a less than glamorous corner of Queens, eating lukewarm protein bars and drinking bitter office coffee just to ensure that my monthly payments to Sally Mae were 3 times the required minimum. But while I was drowning in spreadsheets and debt, my family was performing a masterclass in parasitic luxury, living a life that was physically and ethically offensive to everything I stood for. My father, Richard, who constantly complained about the rising costs of property taxes in Connecticut, suddenly started sporting a $9,000 Breitling Navitimer B01 chronograph on his wrist, a timepiece that featured a slide rule and a complex dial he didn't even know how to read, but which served as a shiny badge of a status he hadn't earned. I watched him at family gatherings, adjusted the weight of that watch with a smug satisfaction, knowing full well that his construction consultancy hadn't seen a major contract in 18 months. And then there was my younger sister, Amanda. At 24, with no official job title other than social media influencer with a measly 4,000 bot followers, she was somehow parading around with her third Hermes Birkin 30 in Togo leather, a bag that costs more than my annual car insurance and rent combined. They treated wealth like a birthright, while I treated it like a discipline, and the contrast was a jagged pill I had to swallow every time we sat down together. In their eyes, I was the boring outcast, the soulless bean counter who didn't understand the art of living, while they were the devoted, loving relatives who spent their days caring for Grandma Helen. In reality, they were nothing more than high-end vultures circling a dying empire, systematically draining Helen's liquidity, while I was the one expected to pick up the tab for our mandatory family dinners. I remember one specific night at La Scale in Greenwich, where the sunset over the harbor was beautiful, but all I could focus on was the bill. The average check for the four of us, including Beverly's penchant for $250 bottles of vintage Meursault and Amanda's habit of ordering 3 different appetizers just to take photos of them, consistently hit $680 before the 20% tip. I would sit there, my mind calculating the cost of those oysters against the hours I'd spent auditing a manufacturing firm in New Jersey, and I would quietly slide my Chase Sapphire Reserve card across the table. They never thanked me. They simply looked at the card with a sneer, as if my ability to pay was just more proof that I was obsessed with money, ignoring the fact that it was my money that kept the wine flowing and the illusion of their prosperity alive. The injustice of it felt like a slow-acting poison in my veins. While I was taking the subway at 2 a.m. to save $20 on an Uber, Richard was taking Helen's 2023 Midnight Black Tesla Model S to the car wash twice a week on her dime. They had convinced Helen that I was too busy with my capitalist games to help with her daily needs, effectively isolating her in a gilded cage of their own making. They managed her errands, which mysteriously coincided with new designer shoes for Beverly and investment pieces for Amanda's wardrobe. Every time I tried to bring up the budget or ask why Helen's utility bills for her estate had tripled in a single quarter, Beverly would let out a theatrical sigh and accuse me of trying to put a price tag on love. She would adjust her pearls and tell me that if I spent more time focusing on family and less time on my quarterly reports, I wouldn't be so cynical. It was a perfect trap. If I questioned the spending, I was a cold-hearted auditor. If I didn't, I was their personal ATM. I remember standing in my kitchen, a space so small I could reach the fridge while standing at the sink, staring at a pile of crumpled receipts and bank statements I had managed to snag from Helen's desk during a rare, unsupervised visit. My eyes, burning from 16 hours of staring at monitors, traced the patterns of miscellaneous withdrawals that totaled nearly $45,000 in 6 months. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the systematic erasure of Helen's legacy. They weren't just spending her cash. They were spending my childhood memories, the house I grew up in, and the security she had worked 50 years to build. I felt like I was screaming underwater. Every $450 hour of my life was a brick in a wall they were using to shut me out, while they used the cracks in that same wall to siphon off everything Helen had left. Now, let me take you back to a specific Tuesday in October, the night I realized exactly how deep the rot went. I had arrived late to a dinner at a steakhouse in Stamford, still wearing my gray charcoal suit from Theory, my hair tied back in a tight professional bun that gave me a slight headache. As I sat down, Amanda was bragging about her new lifestyle coach, who cost $500 a session, and Richard was complaining that the valet had taken too long with the car. The bill came to $742 that night. As I reached for my wallet, I looked at my father's Breitling and realized the second hand wasn't moving. It was a fake, a high-quality super clone from a gray market dealer. That was the moment the scales fell from my eyes. My father wasn't just a parasite, he was a fraud, and he was using my grandmother's dignity to fund a counterfeit life. I realized then that they weren't just loving relatives taking care of an old woman, they were actors in a play, and I was the unsuspecting financier of their entire production. I didn't say anything that night. I just paid the $742, walked out to my 2016 Honda Civic, and sat in the dark for 20 minutes, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine. I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me, the kind of clarity you get when a complex tax loophole finally makes sense. They thought I was a dry outcast because I lived within my means, but they didn't realize that my dryness was actually a reservoir of discipline. They had underestimated the very thing they mocked, my ability to see through the noise and find the truth in the numbers. They were living on borrowed time and stolen money, and I was the only one who knew how to audit the damage. Family isn't about who has the loudest voice at the dinner table or who carries the most expensive bag. It's about who stays when the balance sheet hits zero. And looking at my bank account, which was finally, slowly, beginning to grow as my debt shrunk, I realized that I was the only one in that family who actually had any real equity. The war was no longer just about Helen's health. It was about the $82,400 of my life they had mocked while they built a house of cards on her grave. And I was about to blow the whole thing down. The point of no return for my fractured relationship with my parents occurred last Tuesday within the echoing, hollowed-out chambers of our old family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, a sprawling colonial property that I had just officially purchased from Richard and Beverly for $2,450,000 in a cold, hard cash transaction as they prepared to downsize into a glass-walled luxury condominium in West Palm Beach. I found myself standing in the center of the third-floor attic, a dusty and neglected 450-square-foot space that smelled heavily of aged cardboard, cedar wood, and the stagnant air of decades-old secrets that had been left to rot in the dark, while the rest of the house was scrubbed clean for the sale. I had climbed the narrow, creaking wooden stairs with the intention of beginning the preliminary measurements for a complete structural renovation, my footsteps echoing against the floorboards as I navigated through the labyrinth of discarded furniture and plastic-wrapped memories of a childhood that felt increasingly like a fabrication. As the sharp heel of my navy blue Cole Haan pump caught on a dangerously loose and splintered floorboard near the north-facing dormer window, the wood gave way with a sickening crack, revealing a dark, hollow void between the heavy oak support beams that had remained hidden from sight for years. Reaching into the shadows of the floor cavity, my fingers brushed against the rough felt texture of an antique Stetson hat box, its once sturdy lid coated in a thick layer of gray grime and cobwebs that clung to my skin as I carefully pulled the heavy object out into the pale, dusty light of the afternoon sun. When I pried open the lid of the box, my heart began to pound against my ribs with such violence that I could feel the pulse in my fingertips, because inside, neatly stacked and tied with a fraying piece of blue velvet ribbon, were 47 handwritten letters, each one meticulously addressed to me in the shaky but unmistakably elegant cursive script of my grandmother, Helen. I sat down on a stack of old National Geographic magazines, the air in the attic suddenly feeling too thin to breathe, as I realized that these letters were dated during the exact weeks she had spent in the isolation of Fairfield Medical Center, the very period when Richard and Beverly had stood like impassable sentries at her hospital door, looking me in the eye and lying with practiced ease that she was too tired, too angry, or too disappointed to see me. The first letter I opened was dated May 16th, written on the back of a hospital menu, and in it, Helen described with heartbreaking clarity how my mother had confiscated her iPhone under the guise of reducing her stress levels, effectively cutting off her only lifeline to the outside world and to me. The silence in the attic was so absolute that the sound of my own shallow, ragged breathing felt like a roar in my ears, punctuated only by the distant, muffled hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the street, while the suffocating smell of dry rot and old paper seemed to intensify with every line I read. Helen's words painted a chilling portrait of psychological warfare, detailing how Richard would bring in stacks of legal documents and powers of attorney, placing a pen in her trembling hand while she was still hazy and disoriented from the high doses of morphine the doctors were administering for her pain. She wrote about how she had begged them to call me, how she had asked why I hadn't come to visit her, only for Beverly to lean over her bed and whisper that I was too busy celebrating a new corporate partnership in Manhattan to bother with the bedside of a dying woman. One particular letter, stained with what I could only assume were her tears, described a Tuesday afternoon when she had heard my voice in the hallway, only for my father to close the heavy mahogany door and tell her it was just a noisy nurse, effectively gaslighting a woman whose only crime was having a fortune they wanted to strip mine. I felt a cold, visceral rage beginning to replace the sorrow, a transformative heat that started in my chest and radiated outward to my freezing limbs as I realized the sheer scale of the theatrical performance my parents had maintained for years. They hadn't just stolen her money, they had systematically dismantled her faith in the only person who actually loved her, using her vulnerability as a tool to facilitate their transition into a life of Florida golf courses and designer watches. The letters detailed specific bank account numbers, hidden offshore accounts, and the names of corrupt notaries who had helped Richard forge signatures on documents that transferred the bulk of Helen's liquid assets into a shell company controlled by Beverly. The air on the attic floor felt increasingly oppressive, the heat of the Connecticut summer trapped under the eaves, making the scent of the deteriorating Stetson box and the ancient dust even more nauseating as I gripped the letters until my knuckles turned white. I thought about the $450 an hour I charged to find financial discrepancies for strangers, and yet I had been so blinded by the primal need for parental approval that I had missed the most obvious fraud of my life happening right under my nose. Every letter was a piece of evidence, a testament to a woman's desperate attempt to reach out through the fog of betrayal, and as I looked at the 47 envelopes, I realized they were my true inheritance, far more valuable than the real estate I had just overpaid for. I sat there for hours, the shadows lengthening across the attic floor until the dust motes stopped dancing in the light and the room grew dark, my mind already beginning to categorize the information with the cold, analytical precision of a lead auditor preparing for a hostile takeover. I could almost hear my mother's voice from the hospital lobby again, echoing through the rafters, telling me I was a cold-blooded capitalist. And for the first time in my life, I decided to lean into that description, because if they wanted to play a game of high-stakes financial chess, I was the one who had written the rule book. The realization that my parents had actively watched me suffer, watched me grieve a woman who was still alive and calling for me just to secure their own comfort, broke the final tether of loyalty I had left. I looked at my reflection in a cracked, silver-backed mirror propped against a trunk. My eyes were red, my face pale, but the expression was one of absolute, unyielding resolve. I carefully replaced the letters in the box, treating them with more reverence than I had ever treated a bank statement or a contract, and I stood up, my Cole Haan heels clicking with a new, lethal purpose against the attic floorboards. The smell of the attic, once merely unpleasant, now served as a sensory anchor for my fury, a reminder of the rot that had existed at the core of my family while we pretended to be the pinnacle of East Coast success. I descended the stairs, leaving the darkness of the attic behind, but carrying the light of the truth with me, knowing that by the time the sun rose tomorrow, the downsizing Richard and Beverly were planning would involve a much smaller space than a luxury condo. I was no longer the daughter seeking a seat at their table. I was the auditor who was about to close their account permanently, and as I walked out of the house into the cool evening air, I felt the weight of the last 5 years finally begin to shift from my shoulders to theirs. The 47 letters were tucked under my arm, a ticking time bomb of litigation and social ruin that I was more than ready to detonate. Because in the world of the Harrisons, everything had a price, and I was about to make sure my parents paid every single cent they owed to the memory of Helen. My transition from a grieving granddaughter to a silent executioner was complete, And as I sat in my car, staring at the darkened windows of the mansion, I realized that the house I had just bought was no longer a home. It was a crime scene, and I was the lead investigator. The silence of the night was only broken by the sound of my car door closing, a final, heavy thud that signaled the end of my silence and the beginning of their reckoning. I drove away from the estate, the letters resting on the passenger seat like a loaded weapon, my mind already drafting the opening lines of the legal filing that would strip them of everything they had lied, cheated, and stolen to obtain. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the 47 times they had watched a woman die in spirit before she died in body, and I was going to ensure that the quarterly report of their lives ended in a total, irreversible deficit. The drive from the estate back to my apartment in Tribeca felt like navigating through a fever dream, the neon signs of the highway blurring into long, jagged lines of light as I gripped the steering wheel of my 2016 Honda Civic until my hands went numb. It was exactly 10:14 p.m. when I crossed the threshold of my home, but instead of the usual relief, I felt a cold, calculated hunger for justice that no amount of professional success could ever satisfy. I laid out the 47 letters from the Stetson box across my reclaimed wood dining table, which cost me $5,000, but now felt like nothing more than a makeshift war room. My phone buzzed with a notification, a cheerful automated email from my mother, Beverly, titled Moving Updates, containing a digital brochure for The Azure, a luxury retirement complex in West Palm Beach where the entry fee alone was a staggering $480,000. I stared at the screen, my eyes tracing the images of infinity pools and private cabanas, and I realized I was looking at the physical manifestation of my grandmother's stolen life. Every marble tile in that Florida condo was bought with the morphine-induced silence they had forced upon Helen, and every sunset they planned to watch from their balcony was a sunset they had robbed from her and me. By 3 a.m., I had converted my moleskin notes into a comprehensive digital forensic audit, a spreadsheet so dense with evidence that it would make a federal prosecutor weep with joy. I had tracked a series of suspicious transfers from Helen's trust, which was held at a boutique private bank in Greenwich, to a shell corporation registered in Delaware under the name Blue Sky Holdings. It took me exactly 45 minutes of deep web searching and leveraging my professional network to confirm that the sole officers of Blue Sky Holdings were Richard and Beverly Harrison. They weren't even creative with their theft. They were arrogant, convinced that their boring daughter was too busy calculating depreciation for Fortune 500 companies to notice the hemorrhaging of her own family's estate. The discrepancy was breathtaking. $2,100,000 had been siphoned off over 48 months, disguised as home maintenance, private medical consultations, and estate planning fees. One specific invoice for $85,000 caught my eye, a renovation of the attic I had just stood in, which hadn't seen a hammer or a paintbrush since the late 90s. The air in my apartment felt heavy with the scent of the expensive espresso I was drinking to stay awake, the bitterness on my tongue matching the state of my soul. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. Marcus Thorne, a man who charged $1,200 an hour to dismantle people's lives in a courtroom. When he picked up, his voice was gravelly but sharp. "Bella, it's 3 a.m. Someone die or someone getting sued?" I didn't hesitate. "Both, Marcus. I have 47 letters, a fraudulent shell company, and 2 parents who think they're moving to Florida next week. I need you to freeze every asset they have before the sun comes up." There was a long pause on the other end, the kind of silence that precedes a landslide, and then Marcus spoke, his tone shifting to one of predatory interest. "Send me the file. If the numbers are what you say they are, they won't even have enough cash to buy a coffee by noon." I spent the rest of the night in a state of hyper-focused clarity, the kind of zone I usually entered when a client's entire future was on the line. I thought about the irony of my parents calling me cold-blooded. They were right. I was cold. I was the result of their neglect, a weapon they had forged themselves through years of exclusion and lies. I remembered the way Amanda had looked at me during our last dinner, flaunting her Birkin while complaining about the stress of picking out wallpaper for her new guest suite in Florida. That bag wasn't just leather and gold hardware, it was Helen's dignity, stitched together with threads of betrayal. I felt a grim satisfaction as I hit send on the final data packet to Marcus, knowing that while my parents were dreaming of tropical breezes, I was preparing a blizzard that would bury their gilded world in a mountain of litigation and public shame. The sun began to rise over the Hudson River, the sky turning a bruised shade of purple and orange, and I stood by my window, watching the city wake up. At 8:02 a.m., I received a text from my father. "Bella, don't forget the final walkthrough for the Greenwich house is at 10. We need the keys back." I didn't reply. Instead, I grabbed my coat, tucked the Stetson box into a secure bag, and headed for my car. I wasn't going to a walkthrough, I was going to a takeover. As I pulled out of my garage, the GPS estimated my arrival at the Greenwich estate at exactly 9:45 a.m. I checked my bank app one last time, not to look at my own balance, but to wait for the first sign that Marcus had done his job. And then it happened. A frantic, incoming call from Beverly. I let it ring, and ring, and ring. By the time I pulled into the driveway of the mansion, the 2024 Tesla Model S was already there, but Richard wasn't inside it. He was standing on the front porch, his face a shade of gray that matched the morning mist, clutching his phone like it was a lifeline. Beverly was beside him, her perfect hair disheveled, her voice rising in a shrill, panicked octave as she screamed into her own device. They looked small. For the first time in 32 years, they looked genuinely, pathetically small. I stepped out of my Honda Civic, the door closing with a solid, definitive thud that echoed through the quiet cul-de-sac. I didn't say hello. I didn't ask what was wrong. I simply walked up the stone path, adjusted the lapels of my coat, and looked my father directly in his panicked eyes. "The keys stay with me, Richard," I said, my voice as steady as a heart rate monitor. "And the house isn't the only thing you've lost this morning. I suggest you call a lawyer, though I'm not sure how you'll pay for one since Blue Sky Holdings just had its accounts seized by the state." The look of pure, unadulterated terror that crossed his face was worth every 80-hour week I had ever worked. The audit had officially begun, and the first line item on the sheet was their total and utter ruin. The next morning at exactly 9 a.m., I stood outside the imposing mahogany doors of Marcus Stern, a high-stakes litigation attorney whose hourly rate of $800 was a testament to his reputation as a man who didn't just win cases, but systematically dismantled his opponents until there was nothing left but a settlement check and a public apology. The air inside his corner office on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Stamford smelled of expensive, hand-stitched Italian leather, aged parchment, and the slightly burnt, acidic scent of over-roasted Colombian coffee that sat in a silver carafe on his desk. I didn't wait for him to offer me a seat before I placed the heavy, cream-colored manila folder onto his polished obsidian desk, the sound of the paper hitting the stone echoing through the quiet room like a gavel. Inside that folder were the 47 handwritten letters from the Stetson hat box and a stack of forensic bank statements I had managed to acquire through my own professional channels and back-end access points at the financial institutions where I held a legacy CPA certification. Marcus didn't look up at first, his eyes scanning the summary sheet I had prepared with the cold, unblinking focus of a hawk, while I sat there in my charcoal gray tailored suit, my hands folded perfectly in my lap to hide the fact that I was vibrating with a lethal level of adrenaline. We spent the next 4 hours conducting a brutal, line-by-line audit of the Harrison family's financial betrayal, and as the morning sun crawled across the plush navy carpet, the true scale of the rot began to emerge in cold, undeniable ink. The total amount of documented embezzlement, siphoned directly from Helen's primary trust and various liquid savings accounts over the last few years, reached the staggering sum of $1,112,320. Every cent of that money was a betrayal of a woman who was too medicated to fight back, and every dollar had been spent on maintaining the hollow, shimmering facade of my parents' social status. I watched Marcus's pen move across the ledger, circling suspicious wire transfers to Blue Sky Holdings and noting the dates that aligned perfectly with my sister Amanda's sudden acquisitions of designer accessories. But the financial records weren't the only weapon I had brought to this war, because I had also leveraged my connections with the security director at Fairfield Medical Center to obtain archival surveillance footage from late 2019, a digital ghost that Richard and Beverly thought had been deleted years ago. On the glowing screen of Marcus's monitor, we watched a grainy, time-stamped video from November 12th, where at exactly 15:12 p.m., my father was seen entering Helen's private suite with a calculated, predatory stride. The footage showed him leaning over her bed, his face twisted in a mask of impatient rage that I had seen many times during my childhood, before he violently wrenched her iPhone 13 Pro out of her frail, trembling hands and tucked it into his jacket pocket. The image of my grandmother's hand reaching out into the empty air of the hospital room, a silent plea for a connection he was determined to sever, made my vision go white with a fury so intense it felt like a physical burn. Marcus slowed the footage down, zooming in on the timestamp and the clear view of Richard's face as he walked out of the room, looking at the device with a smirk that suggested he had just won a trophy rather than silenced a dying woman. That 30-second clip was the final piece of my arsenal, the emotional anchor that would turn a complex financial fraud case into a devastating criminal investigation for elder abuse and grand larceny. The office was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the building's HVAC system and the distant sirens of the city below. But inside the four walls of that room, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of an impending execution. I had spent years being the quiet, dutiful daughter who paid for the dinners and ignored the insults. But as I looked at the audit results and the video evidence, I realized that my parents had underestimated the very thing they mocked, my ability to see everything and forget nothing. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register as I told Marcus that I didn't want a settlement or a quiet apology. I wanted the full weight of the law to crush them until they were forced to see the reflection of their own cruelty in a courtroom. We began drafting the subpoenas for the Delaware Shell Corporation and the emergency injunctions to freeze their remaining assets, ensuring that the luxury condo in West Palm Beach remained a distant, impossible dream. Every document we produced was a brick in a wall that was slowly closing in on Richard and Beverly, and I felt a grim, professional satisfaction in knowing that my career as a financial analyst had been the ultimate training ground for this moment of reckoning. The smell of the burnt coffee in the room no longer bothered me. It felt like the scent of a long, sleepless night that was finally coming to an end with the arrival of a cold, unforgiving dawn. I thought about the $450 an hour I had spent my life earning, and how every single one of those hours had led me to this desk, paying Marcus $800 an hour to finish the job I had started on that dusty attic floor. Marcus looked at me over the rim of his glasses, his expression one of professional respect, and asked me if I was prepared for the social fallout in Greenwich, where our name was still synonymous with old-school dignity. I told him that the name Harrison was already dead, buried under $1 million of stolen money and 47 letters of heartbreak, and that I was more than happy to be the one who performed the autopsy in public. We finalized the strategy by 1:30 p.m., creating a timeline that would hit them with the force of a tidal wave, starting with a frozen bank account and ending with a formal serving of papers at their favorite lunch spot. The precision of our plan was beautiful in its lethality, a perfect mathematical equation where the only variable left was how long it would take for them to realize they were drowning. As I stood up to leave, Marcus handed me a copy of the audit summary, the numbers laid out in a grid that looked like a map of a battlefield I had already conquered. I walked out of his office and into the bright midday sun of Stamford, the light reflecting off the glass buildings and making me squint, but my internal vision had never been clearer. I walked toward my car, my heels clicking on the pavement with the rhythm of a ticking clock, and I felt the weight of the last 5 years finally beginning to dissipate, replaced by the heavy, solid armor of a woman who was no longer a victim. I checked the time on my own watch. Not a Breitling, but a simple, functional piece that kept perfect time, and noted that it was exactly 2 p.m. In less than 24 hours, the world my parents had built on the bones of my grandmother's legacy would start to crumble, and I would be there to watch every single stone fall. The arsenal was ready, the targets were locked, and the first shot had already been fired the moment I handed that manila folder across the obsidian desk. I sat in my Honda Civic for a moment, the heat of the car pressing against me, and I took a deep, steady breath of the Connecticut air, which finally felt clean for the first time since I was a child. The letters were safe, the evidence was documented, and the numbers were irrefutable, leaving no room for the lies that Beverly and Richard had used to define my life. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a total reclamation of the truth, and I was the only person with the keys to the vault where that truth was kept. As I drove away from the tower, I didn't look back at the hospital or the mansion, focusing only on the road ahead and the inevitable collapse of the Harrison Empire, knowing that the quarterly report for my parents' lives was about to show a total, irrecoverable loss. Every step of this process had been meticulously planned, from the audit to the surveillance footage, and I knew that when the final balance sheet was drawn, I would be the only one left standing with any real equity in this family. The smell of the leather in Marcus's office lingered on my coat, a reminder of the professional coldness I had embraced to protect the woman who had loved me, and I welcomed it as a necessary part of the war I was about to win. The trap snapped shut on a humid Saturday evening that felt like the climax of a long, calculated architectural plan designed specifically for the structural collapse of my parents' lies. Richard and Beverly, in their characteristic arrogance, had decided to host what they called a farewell gala in the very Greenwich mansion I had just purchased from them for over $2 million in cash, inviting 45 of their most influential friends from the country club and the local business circles. They moved through the house as if they still owned the air itself, serving expensive catering from Lescal that featured $300 platters of Wagyu beef sliders and vintage Krug champagne, all of which, ironically, was being billed to the house account I had technically inherited. My younger sister, Amanda, made her grand entrance at approximately 7:15 p.m., floating across the mahogany floors in a $4,200 Oscar de la Renta silk file cocktail dress in a shade of emerald green that matched the envy she usually hid behind her influencer persona. I watched her from the shadows of the second-floor landing, knowing with absolute mathematical certainty that the dress had been purchased using a direct wire transfer from Helen's diverted retirement fund just 3 weeks prior, a transaction I had flagged in red ink on my master audit sheet. It was exactly 20 p.m. when the heavy grandfather clock in the foyer struck the hour, and I descended the grand staircase, my charcoal gray Theory power suit fitting me like a suit of high-grade ballistic armor, every seam perfectly aligned to project a cold, unshakable authority. I wasn't carrying a glass of wine or a party favor. Instead, I gripped the thick, cream-colored manila folder that contained the 47 letters from the Stetson box and the forensic audit results that Marcus Stern had finalized only hours before. The living room was a sea of pearls, silk ties, and forced laughter, the scent of expensive lilies and high-end hors d'oeuvres filling the air, while my father stood by the fireplace, adjusting his counterfeit Breitling and regaling a group of investors with stories of his upcoming consultancy expansion in Florida. He looked up and saw me, a flicker of genuine irritation crossing his face, because I wasn't wearing the submissive, apologetic expression he had trained me to wear for 32 years. I ignored his dismissive wave and walked straight toward the small mahogany podium that had been set up for the farewell toasts, my Cole Haan heels clicking against the floor with a lethal, rhythmic precision that seemed to silence the room one guest at a time. The guests continued to laugh and chatter for a few more seconds, oblivious to the fact that they were standing in the middle of a crime scene where the primary evidence was about to be broadcast to the entire social register of Greenwich. I reached the microphone, the feedback hum echoing through the high-vaulted ceiling like a warning siren, and I waited until the last voice trailed off, leaving only the sound of the evening wind rattling the window panes of the library. Beverly was standing near the buffet table holding a crystal flute of champagne and looking at me with a mask of maternal concern that was so thin I could see the panic beginning to bloom in her eyes. I didn't smile, and I didn't offer a polite introduction. Instead, I opened the manila folder and laid the first letter, the one where Helen begged for a glass of clean water, directly onto the podium. The silence in the room became so dense it felt like a physical weight, a suffocating vacuum where the only thing that existed was the cold, blue light of the chandeliers reflecting off my silver Mont Blanc pen. I looked out at the 45 guests, many of whom had known me since I was a child, and I saw my father take a step forward, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple as he realized I wasn't there to give a heartfelt goodbye. I could smell the faint metallic scent of the microphone and the heavy perfume of the woman in the front row, a sensory overload that anchored me to the moment of my final, absolute reclamation of the truth. Amanda was frozen mid-sip, her Oscar de la Renta dress suddenly looking like a cheap costume in the harsh light of the revelation I was about to deliver. Every 80-hour work week, every insult about my cold-blooded capitalism, and every night I spent paying off my $82,000 debt while they lived on stolen luxury led to this specific second in time. I cleared my throat, the sound amplified and sharp, and I began to read the first line of the audit summary, the number $1,112,320 ringing out like a death knell for the Harrison family name. I watched the color drain from Richard's face as I mentioned Blue Sky Holdings and the surveillance footage from room 412, and in that moment, I realized that I wasn't just a daughter seeking revenge. I was the auditor who had finally arrived to close an account that had been in a moral deficit for far too long. The room was so quiet I could hear the rhythmic ticking of my own watch, a sound that reminded me that my time as a victim had officially expired at 20 p.m. sharp. I looked directly at my mother, who was now clutching her Chanel bag so hard her knuckles were white, and I realized that the family values she had accused me of lacking were nothing more than a cover for the predatory greed that had fueled their lifestyle. The catering, the champagne, the designer dresses, and the luxury condo were all crumbling into ash under the weight of the 47 letters I held in my hand. I felt a strange, detached sense of peace, the kind of clarity that only comes when the numbers finally balance and the truth is the only thing left on the ledger. This was the trap they had built for themselves, a grand stage where they expected to be celebrated for their exit. But instead, they were about to be exposed for the parasites they had become. I took a deep breath, the air in the room finally feeling like it belonged to me and me alone. And I continued to read the list of every transaction, every forged signature, and every stolen sunset they had taken from Helen. The Prощalna Večírka had indeed become a farewell, but not the one they had planned. It was the final, irrevocable goodbye to the lies that had defined my life for 5 long years. As the first guest began to whisper and the realization of the scandal started to spread through the room like a virus, I stood my ground at the microphone, a senior tax consultant who had just completed the most important audit of her life. The scent of the dry rot from the attic seemed to linger on the letters, a ghostly reminder of why I was doing this. And as I turned the page to the next set of evidence, I knew that by the time the guests left tonight, the Harrison name would be worth less than the paper I was reading from. I didn't care about the social fallout or the whispers at the country club. I cared about the woman who had died believing I had abandoned her, and I was going to ensure that her voice was the only one that truly mattered in this house from this night forward. The trap had captured exactly what it was meant to. The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, calculated to the very last cent of their betrayal. I stepped into the center of the grand living room, my presence slicing through the festive atmosphere like a surgical blade, and as I reached for the microphone, the feedback hum silenced the 45 guests who were busy consuming high-end appetizers funded by a woman they had all helped my parents ignore. "May I have a moment of your attention?" I said, and my voice was as flat and terrifyingly steady as a heart rate monitor's line after it stops pulsing, a sound that carried across the vaulted ceilings of the Greenwich estate and made the laughter die in the throats of the town's social elite. I did not raise my voice, nor did I show a single flicker of the burning rage that had sustained me through 5 years of isolation. Instead, I began to read the cold, hard data from the forensic audit with the clinical detachment of a lead prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "Transaction number 482, I began, my words echoing against the mahogany-paneled walls. $50,000 transferred from Helen Harrison's primary healthcare trust directly to a dealership in Fairfield for the purchase of a 2024 Lexus RX for Amanda Harrison. A transaction that was processed exactly 48 hours before my grandmother took her final breath while she was allegedly too medicated to recognize her own name. I began to walk through the crowd, my Cole Haan heels clicking with a lethal rhythmic precision on the hardwood floors, and I started handing out high-resolution photocopies of the 47 letters I had found in the Stetson hat box, ensuring that every prominent neighbor and business partner saw the shaky, desperate handwriting of a woman who had been imprisoned by her own children. I watched as Beverly Harrison, my mother, froze in the middle of the room, her face turning the color of ash as she realized that her reign as the matriarch of Greenwich High Society was ending in a public execution of her reputation. In her shock, she let her $12 glass of chilled Chardonnay slip from her manicured fingers, and I watched with a detached sense of satisfaction as the pale yellow liquid hit the cream-colored Persian rug, spreading out in a jagged, ugly stain that looked like a spreading pool of blood under the chandelier light. Richard Harrison, my father, stepped forward with his jaw clenched, his face a deep, dangerous shade of purple as he tried to speak, his hand instinctively reaching for the counterfeit Breitling on his wrist, as if it could provide him with some shred of the authority he had just lost. But I didn't give him the chance to utter a single lie, because I immediately pivoted to the next section of the manila folder, reading aloud the formal conclusion of the third-party forensic handwriting expert regarding the blatant forgery of Helen's signature on the power of attorney documents dated December 2022. I detailed how the loops in the H and the pressure of the N did not match a single document signed by my grandmother in the last 50 years, proving that my father had sat in his home office and signed away her life and her legacy while she lay helpless in room 412 of Fairfield Medical Center. The guests, people who had known my parents for decades, began to physically turn away, some of them setting down their plates of Wagyu beef as if the food had suddenly turned to ash in their mouths, their eyes darting toward the exits in a desperate attempt to distance themselves from the radioactive scandal unfolding before them. Amanda, my younger sister, who had spent the evening preening in her $4,000 Oscar de la Renta dress, began to retreat into the shadows of the corner, clutching her emerald green skirts as if they could shield her from the reality that her entire lifestyle was built on the systematic theft of our grandmother's peace. I described the exact moment, captured on the surveillance archives I had recovered, when Richard had physically intercepted the private nurse I had hired, firing her on the spot to ensure that no one outside their circle of lies could report the truth of Helen's deteriorating condition. The silence in the room was so absolute that I could hear the faint, frantic breathing of my mother as she realized that the luxury condominium in West Palm Beach was now a phantom dream, replaced by the very real possibility of a grand larceny indictment and a lifetime of social pariahdom. This was not just a disagreement over an inheritance. It was a public dismantling of a fraudulent dynasty, a clinical strike against the people who had called me a cold-blooded capitalist while they were busy harvesting the assets of a dying woman like common vultures. I didn't stop until I had listed every suspicious wire transfer to Blue Sky Holdings, every diverted dividend, and every unpaid medical bill that I had eventually covered out of my own pocket while they lived in a house of cards. The smell of the spilled wine and the scent of the lilies in the foyer became the olfactory backdrop for their total destruction, a sensory anchor that I would carry with me as proof that I had finally balanced the scales of justice for the woman who raised me. As I reached the final page of the audit, I looked my father directly in the eye, seeing for the first time the hollow, terrified man hiding behind the expensive suits and the suburban prestige, and I felt nothing but the icy clarity of a job well done. The public execution by fax was complete, and as the last guest shuffled out of the front door without so much as a backward glance at the hosts, the social status of the Harrisons in the state of Connecticut was officially declared dead at 20:22 p.m. My father's attempt to mount a defense died in his throat as he looked at the sheer volume of evidence scattered across his own living room, the 47 letters acting as silent witnesses to his cruelty and greed. Beverly was leaning against the piano, her shoulders slumped, the perfect bob she had maintained for years now messy and sticking to her tear-stained face, proving that even the most expensive linen suit cannot hide the rot of a broken character. Amanda was sobbing silently in the corner, the green dress now a symbol of her complicity rather than her beauty. While I stood at the podium with my theory suit still perfectly pressed, a senior tax consultant who had just closed the most complex and personal audit of her entire career. The house, which had been filled with the sounds of artificial joy only an hour ago, was now a tomb of secrets, and I was the only person with the keys to the truth. I looked at the stain on the rug one last time, thinking about how easily things fall apart when they are built on a foundation of theft and gaslighting, and I realized that my 5 years of suffering were finally being paid back at the highest possible market rate. There were no more quarterly reports to hide behind, no more fake smiles for the neighbors, and no more lies about grandmother's wishes. There was only the cold, unyielding reality of the numbers I had presented. I had not only protected Helen's legacy, but I had also reclaimed my own identity from the narrative of the boring outcast they had tried to impose on me since childhood. As I prepared to walk out of the house, leaving them to sit in the ruins of their own making, I felt a sense of peace that no bank balance could ever provide, knowing that the 47 letters had finally found their target and hit with the force of a nuclear blast. The quarterly report of their lives had ended in a total, irreversible deficit, and as I stepped out into the cool night air, I knew that the audit of the Harrison family was officially closed, with no possibility of appeal or recovery. Every detail of this night was etched into my memory, from the exact time Beverly dropped her glass to the look of sheer, unadulterated defeat on Richard's face, serving as the final entry in the ledger of my family's history. I was no longer the daughter who wasn't enough. I was the auditor who had seen everything. And in the end, that was the only power that mattered in the world we lived in. It is exactly 3:14 a.m. as I sit here in the profound, heavy silence of my clean and quiet apartment in Tribeca, the low hum of the city outside acting as a distant white noise to the absolute clarity I have finally achieved after 5 years of living in a manufactured fog of guilt and perceived inadequacy. The moonlight filters through my floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, silver rectangles across the reclaimed oak floorboards, and for the first time in my adult life, the air in my lungs feels light, unburdened by the suffocating weight of my parents' expectations or the toxic debris of their systematic deception. Earlier today, Marcus Stern sent me the final confirmation that the formal legal complaints have been served, demanding the immediate repayment of the full embezzled sum plus accrued interest and punitive damages, bringing the total liability to a staggering $1,450,000. This figure represents more than just a financial debt. It is the mathematical equivalent of their complete and total bankruptcy, a definitive end to the luxury lifestyle they attempted to build on the foundation of my grandmother's suffering and my own professional exhaustion. I watched the digital tracker as the papers were delivered to the doorstep of their temporary rental, knowing that at that very moment, the dream of the Florida sunshine and the glass-walled condominium in West Palm Beach was being permanently extinguished by the cold reality of a lawsuit they cannot win and a reputation they can never repair. My sister Amanda has already received notice that the down payment on her luxury condo, which was funded entirely by the illicit siphoning of Helen's retirement accounts, has been frozen by a court order, effectively rendering her homeless and stripping her of the emerald green illusions she wore so proudly at the farewell gala. I have been informed by Marcus that my father, Richard, has been forced to list his collection of high-end watches, including the counterfeit Breitling Navitimer that served as the centerpiece of his fraudulent identity, in a desperate and futile attempt to cover the initial legal retainers for a defense that is already dead in the water. I have established ironclad, non-negotiable boundaries through a formal restraining order that prohibits Beverly, Richard, or Amanda from approaching my person or my residence within a 500-yard radius, a physical and legal barrier that ensures any attempt to manipulate my emotions or invade my space will result in an immediate police response and further criminal complications. There is a strange, clinical peace in knowing that I am no longer a daughter waiting for a love that was never available, but a woman who has successfully audited her own life and removed the entities that were causing a terminal deficit in her soul. The catharsis I feel tonight does not stem from a primitive desire for revenge or the sight of their social ruin, but rather from the quiet, indestructible power of the truth that I recovered from that dusty Stetson box on a Tuesday afternoon in Greenwich. I look at my hands in the dim light of the desk lamp, the same hands that meticulously traced every fraudulent wire transfer and every forged signature, and I realize that my cold-blooded, analytical mind was the very thing that saved me from a lifetime of being their silent financier. The smell of the old paper from the 47 letters still seems to linger in the room, a ghostly but comforting reminder that Helen's voice was finally heard through the roar of their betrayal, and that her legacy is now safe in the hands of the only person who actually valued her humanity over her net worth. I remember the look on Beverly's face as the wine stains spread across the rug, a visual metaphor for the irreversible damage they had done to our family bond, and I feel a profound sense of relief that I am no longer the one tasked with cleaning up their messes or validating their lies. The quarterly report of my life has finally reached a state of perfect balance, where the cost of losing my biological family is far outweighed by the profit of gaining my own dignity and the absolute freedom to live without the shadow of their gaslighting. I think about the 80-hour weeks and the 2016 Honda Civic that they mocked so relentlessly, and I realize that those years of discipline were the forge in which I created the strength to dismantle their empire of cards. Every dollar of my student debt that I paid off with my own sweat was a brick in the fortress I now inhabit, a fortress where transparency is the only currency and where the doors are permanently locked against those who view love as a leverage point for theft. The silence of 3:14 a.m. is not a lonely silence. It is the sound of a settled account, the quiet vibration of a life that has been stripped of its parasites and returned to its rightful owner. I have spent 32 years seeking a seat at a table that was rigged against me, only to find that the most important table is the one I built myself, where the only guests allowed are those who come with honest hearts and clean hands. The 47 letters are now stored in a fireproof safe, not as a source of pain, but as a testament to the fact that the truth always finds a way to the surface, provided there is someone brave enough to dig through the dust to find it. As I prepare to finally close my eyes and sleep without the phantom pressure of their disappointment, I know that tomorrow will be the first day of a new fiscal year for my spirit, one where the dividends are peace, integrity, and the unbreakable resolve of a woman who knows exactly what she is worth. The Harrison name may be tarnished beyond recognition in the social registers of Connecticut, but my name, Bella Harrison, has been redeemed by the very facts that they tried to bury in the dark corners of a forgotten attic. Family is not defined by the blood that flows through your veins or the name on a birth certificate, but by the actions taken in the quiet moments when no one is watching, and by that measure, I am finally part of a family of one that I can truly respect. The journey from the hospital lobby to this quiet apartment was paved with $1 million of stolen money and 47 letters of heartbreak, but every step was necessary to reach this moment of absolute, unyielding clarity. I am no longer the victim of their narrative. I am the author of my own, and the final chapter of their influence over me has been written in the ink of a court-mandated bankruptcy filing. As the first light of dawn begins to touch the edges of the Manhattan skyline, I realize that the war is over, and while the casualties were high, the victory is absolute because it was won with the only weapon that cannot be forged or stolen, the unvarnished truth. This is the moral of the ledger. When the people who are supposed to protect you become the ones you need protection from, the only way to survive is to become your own fiercest auditor, and to never, ever accept a balance sheet that includes the sacrifice of your own self-respect. My life is now a clean slate, a perfectly balanced book, and as I finally drift into a deep and dreamless sleep, I know that the truth didn't just set me free. It gave me back the world that they tried to steal from me one quarterly report at a time. I have achieved the ultimate financial and emotional independence, leaving the wreckage of their lives behind like the dry rot in the attic of a house I no longer wish to call home. My parents and sister are now just names on a legal document, entries in a closed file that I will never need to reopen, because I have learned that some debts can only be settled by walking away and never looking back. The audit is complete, the findings are final, and the Harrison family estate has been liquidated of its lies, leaving only the quiet, steady pulse of a woman who finally knows who she is and what she stands for in a world of counterfeit Breitlings and silk veil dresses. This was the final price of their betrayal, and it was a price I was more than willing to make them pay to ensure that the memory of Helen Harrison is never again used as a pawn in their pathetic, greedy games. My name is Bella. I am 32 years old, and for the first time in my life, I am not just a daughter or a consultant, I am free.